President Jimmy Carter was elected as a Democrat, but he had an unlikely friendship with a Republican congressman from Peoria. Taylor Fleming went to the Dirksen Congressional Center to learn more.
Letters and photographs found here show President Carter's friendship with Peoria native Bob Michel.
The odds were certainly against Michel, a Republican congressman, and President Carter becoming friends. They were leaders in opposing political parties, and Carter had just defeated Michel's friend Gerald Ford. They became allies when Carter cut what he called unnecessary projects out of the federal budget early in his presidency. Several members of Congress opposed this, but Michel supported Carter because he believed it helped taxpayers.
Even though they disagreed politically on a lot of things over the years, they still managed to have a personal exchange and build on the similarities that they had between them.
Michel was there in 1979 when the Egyptian president and Israeli prime minister visited the White House and even snapped a picture of Carter on his personal camera. Michel helped host Carter when he visited Washington, D.C. after his presidency, and Carter invited Michel to the Carter Center. Carter passed away in late December.
It's important to remember that there were connections across the aisle like this. When we're in such a fractured time now, when we can look back at those examples of people who were able to find points of agreement and work together.
In Pekin, Taylor Fleming, 25 News.